What is going on, you guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be building a web API using TypeScript along with ExpressJS, which, as you can see here on the web page, is a fast, unopinionated, and minimalist web framework for Node.js. Along with that, we're going to use Prisma, which is a Node.js and TypeScript ORM, and this is what we will use to communicate with our database. Now, as far as databases are concerned, you can use whatever you want. You can see here the listed databases that I think Prisma supports, such as PostgreSQL or MySQL, even MongoDB. However, to kind of not go too deep into the realm of setting up databases, I'm going to use SQLite, as that is pretty easy to do. However, if you want to go ahead and use PostgreSQL, you can, or whatever database you want to use. And if you want to follow along with how to set that up, it's super quick and easy. You can see here on their docs page on how to do that. The last thing I want to note before we jump into making our installations is that I'm going to be using this application called Insomnia. And what this allows us to do is just very easily communicate with any API, or in our case, the API that we're going to build. Now, if you're using Postman, this is very similar as well. And if you're comfortable using Postman or curl, feel free to do so. However, I definitely recommend this if anyone's looking for a nice interface for our APIs. Okay, so that about sums up the intro for this video. Let's go ahead now and make, first of all, set up our project and then make the necessary installations. So the first thing is that I've created a directory called express-typescript-api. This is also a GitHub repo, which you can find all the code in the link in the description below. However, let's go ahead now and run npm init-y. Now this will just say yes to everything inside our npm init. So clear all this. So now if you list it, you can see that we have our package.json. The next thing is to make the first set of installations. So first we'll install express.env, cause, express validator. I'll explain all of this in a second. And Prisma /client. Hit enter. Now, Express, which is just the web framework, that's for this one, .env, that just allows us to load environment variables from our .env file. Cause, which is just middleware for our Express application, or that enables cause, sorry. Express validator just validate our API body, or when we post something or put something, this just adds an extra layer of validation. And then Prisma /client, which is our Prisma client. Okay, let me just clear that. The next set is our developer dependencies. So npm install -D TypeScript, and then @types /node, @types /express, @types /.env, @types /cause. Okay, so that's for our types and TypeScript. The next is, again, some developer dependencies, but I just didn't want to overextend that line. So the first one being Prisma itself, then ES-build -register and nodemon. So we need ES-build as we're going to be seeding our database with data before we jump into the API. That way we don't have to worry so much about always adding data in every time we reset our database, and nodemon just for live reload. So hit enter on that. And we're all good. So now if I clear everything and list out our directory, so we have now our node modules, package.lock.json and package.json. All right, so now that we have our installations all done, let's go ahead and set up our database. And because I'll be using SQLite, I'll be running the following command: npx prisma init, and then dash dash data source dash provider, and then SQLite. So if you're using PostgreSQL, before replacing this with PostgreSQL, definitely go ahead and check out the docs or any other database. The setup is very simple. So hit enter, and you should see something like this, which is basically something that indicates a success message. Maybe if you're watching this in the future, it looks different, but hopefully you should see more green and no red. All right, so now that we have our database, I'm just going to go ahead and open this up inside of TypeScript, VS Code. All right. Whoops. So if I just zoom in a little bit, maybe that's too much, but hopefully you guys get a clear idea of what the Explorer looks like on mine, and hopefully it should look similar in yours. But first of all, I have this Prisma directory, which holds a schema.prisma. And this is where we will define our models. We have this .env file, which has been generated for us right now by Prisma. And this holds the URL for our database. Again, if you're using PostgreSQL, this could be a link. And otherwise, that's pretty much it. So the first thing to do is inside our schema.prisma, we have all this added for us beforehand. But let's go ahead and actually, before we go ahead and define any models, let me first give you an idea of what this web API is going to do. It's something fairly simple. It's just going to represent books and authors. So kind of like imagine a library API where we have a set of authors and we have a set of books. Now, to begin, let's go ahead and first define what an author will look like. So I'm going to go ahead and say model and then author. So this is the name of our table, first indicated with the keyword model. Actually, before I continue, there are some, if you're using VS Code, there are some nice extensions that you can add. For example, Prisma, which helps with the schema.prisma. That way you get some color coding as well as type hinting. The other one is SQLite. So if you're following this tutorial word for word, so for example, with the same database, you can download this SQLite extension, which just adds like a nice interface for you to view your SQLite tables. All right, so hopefully if you guys are following along, please go ahead and install those on VS Code, as they help a lot. But back inside our author model, first we need to add the ID, which is going to be an integer. Say ID at default, and we'll say auto increment. That way the ID will always increment by 1. So first we will have an author with ID 1, then author by ID 2, and we don't have to worry about setting this. Next we'll have created at, which tends to be customary to add for our tables. We have updated at, which will be date time, and just here at created at we'll say default and now. And for our created at, we'll just say updated at. Then an author will have a first name, which is a string, a last name, which is a string, and that's about it. So that's our author. The next thing is our book. So we'll say model book, and this again will have ID created and updated at. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, add this here. Then a title, which is string, is fiction, which is a boolean, so true false. We'll have a date published, which is date time. And next, a book will have a reference to an author. So we're going to just assume that one book will have one author rather than having a set of authors. So we'll say author and then author. If I hit save, and if you have that extension, that Prisma extension in your VS Code, if you hit save, you should see all this autocomplete. Now, First thing to note is this author is just for Prisma's sake. It's for our ORM. You will not see this as a column in our database, but rather you will see the author ID representing the link between book and author. And I'll show you that in a second. The next is that inside our author, we set the relations. So we'll say the relation between book and author can be found inside the book model via author ID. And the references here is referring to the ID of author. So this will just store the author ID. And one thing it didn't add, which I would like to, is this on delete. And what this just means is that when we delete an author, all of the books will delete with it. That way we're not left with authorless books in our database. But that pretty much sums up our schema file. The next thing we want to do is inside our terminal. Let's go ahead and first create our database and add these new models to it. And to do that, let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see what I write. To do that, enter npx prisma db push. And you should get the following output, which is pretty much a success message saying that your database is now in sync with your schema. Zoom out and just shrink this. But if I open up my Explorer now, you should see inside of your Prisma directory a dev.db file. That's only if you are using SQLite. If you're using any other, your changes should be reflected in your database and you'll be able to see them there. All right, so let's go ahead now and use this SQLite extension that I installed. Hit open database, and you can see down below here, you can see SQLite Explorer. Now I can open this up and you should see dev.db or the name of your database, and you'll see the models that we defined. So we have author and book. If I open up book, you'll see all the columns that we defined, such as ID, created at, etc., along with their types. And as I mentioned earlier, the author itself, as we defined it in our model book, is not written into the database, but rather the author ID. So this is the reference point between book and author. And you can also see an author or the other columns that we added. Now you can click this play button to see what the table looks like. However, as we have no data, there's no point checking that out just yet. All right, so that's our schema all set up. The next thing I want to do is, first of all, let's go into our package.json. Now, the first thing we should set up is our scripts. So for our API, let's go ahead and add in our dev setup. So we'll say node-mon and then src/index.ts. So this will, when we run npm run dev, this will run our index.ts. Of course, this won't work right now as we have no such file or directory. But let's go ahead and define that. So let's create a new folder. We'll call this src. And inside that, let's just create an index.ts file, which we won't add anything to just yet, but let's just keep it there for safekeeping. All right, so inside our src or our source folder, I want to go ahead and create a new folder called utils. And inside that, I want to create a new file called db.server.ts or /ts. Just delete that. Move to trash. New file db.server.ts. All right, so in this file, we're going to basically define our Prisma client. Now, our Prisma client is what we're going to use to interact with our database via Prisma. So the first thing to do is say import Prisma client from Prisma client. So something just like this, as I wrote on line 1. Next, they'll say let db, which is of type Prisma client. We'll say declare global, and then var __db Prisma client undefined, and I'll explain why we're doing all this in a second. Then we'll say if not global dot underscore db. We'll say global dot underscore db equals new Prisma client, and then db equals global dot underscore db, and we'll just export this database. All right, so why are we going to such lengths to create our Prisma client, whereas we could just import it in any file where we need it? So the first thing, or mainly the only thing, is that every time we use or every time we reload our application, as we're using a kind of hot reloader, so we don't have to keep on restarting our server, a new Prisma client will be created. And what we don't want is like 10 or more connections to our database. We pretty much just want one. And this will just check to see if a Prisma client already exists or a connection already exists, and use that connection. Sorry, losing my words. Otherwise, it will create a new one. That way we can use this database elsewhere inside our project. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this and close our package.json. Now back inside our Prisma directory, let's go ahead and create a new file called seed.ts. And this is where we're going to write the functionality to load default data into our database. That way we don't have to keep on adding data into our database every time we reset it. So first, let's go ahead and import that fancy DB that we defined earlier from .source utils db server. Let's go ahead and create some types. So the first one is going to be the type author, and this will take a first name, which is a string, and last name, string. And we're missing an equals here. But why am I just defining first name and last name, whereas in our author model we have a bunch of other columns such as ID, created, updated, and this book thing here? First of all, this book thing isn't actually a column, so we can ignore that one. But for the first three, so ID, created, and updated at, these are pieces of data that are added by the database itself, so we don't have to worry about adding any of this in, as the ID is set by default and is just auto increments. The created at and updated at just takes the current time of creation for that row and adds it in. So all we have to worry about is first name and last name. The next, let's go ahead and define the type for our book. So type book equals, and then we have our title, so string in lowercase. We have is fiction, which is a Boolean. We have date published, which is just a date. All right, so the same thing which I said for author can also be applied to the book, as we're only worried about title, is fiction, date published. All the other things are added by the database by default, sorry. The other thing is that we haven't added our author ID, as this is something that we're going to handle ourselves manually. All right, so let's go ahead and create our authors first. So let's create a function that deals with that. So I'm going to go ahead and say function get authors. This is going to return an array of author. We'll say return, and then inside each one, let's go ahead and say first name. We'll say John. Oops. Last name Doe. Then we have first name, which we'll say is William, and then last name Shakespeare. And then let's add one more. Let's add Yuval Noah. and last name Harari. All right, so this is our get authors. Let me just shrink this a bit so we can see. So this just returns an array of authors. Now the next one is our book. So we'll say the same thing here. We'll say function get books, which is an array of book. And this we'll say title is Sapien. So we'll just add a bunch of books by Yuval Noah Harari. We'll say is fiction false, and date published, say new date. Don't worry about adding that in specifically. And then title, we'll say Homo Deus. Is fiction, we'll say false, and date published can be new date. And finally, let's just make up some fictional book that he wrote. So say title, and let's just say he wrote The Ugly Duckling. And is fiction true, and date published new date. All right, so this gets our books that we'll add to our database, and we also have our get authors. Now that we have this, let's go ahead now and create a new function. We'll say this is an asynchronous function, and we'll call this seed. And what we'll do here is first, let's create our authors. So promise dot all, so get authors, oops, and then map author, and this will return, and this is where we get our first taste of our Prisma client. So DB, which we already imported earlier, author, and then create. Inside that, we say data, and sorry about all these tooltips. And then we'll say first name is author dot first name, last name is author dot last name. Okay, so this creates all of our authors. The next thing is we need to go ahead and let me just make sure all these brackets align. Why is this guy complaining? All right, let's just go ahead and finish this function first. All right, so now that we have this, let's go ahead now and get our author. So const author equals await, and then db dot author, and we want Yuval Noah Harari because we want to add the books for him. So say find first, and we'll say where first name is Yuval, because we can't guarantee the ID beforehand. Actually, why is this complaining? Let me just take this and all right, so we have this map, we have author, we have this guy, and then this. I think what it's waiting for is that, yeah, it was just missing a bracket there. Okay, let me just paste that all stuff back in. So let's get the author where the first name is Yuval Noah Harari. We can't always guarantee Yuval Noah Harari will be ID 3, but we can guarantee that the first name is Yuval Noah, as we have specified that here. Okay, now that we have the author, we can go ahead now and create our books. So we'll do something similar as well. So we'll say await, and then promise dot all. Inside this, get books dot map, and we'll say element book. Let's go ahead and extract the date, the properties. So title is fiction and date published from our book. Then we'll return db.book.create, and then data, and we can just add in title, as so we don't have to make the keyword, as it can be inferred based on the name of the variable, is fiction, date published, and the author ID, which we need to specify, is just author.id. And then finally, let's just below this, let's just call our seed function. So make sure you add this, otherwise none of this will run. But that's about it. This just adds, like I said earlier, adds the data to our database. However, we need to let package.json or Prisma know that we have this seed function. So inside package.json, what we need to go ahead and specify is wherever, I don't think we already have it, but just here, let's go ahead and create a key called Prisma. Inside that, we'll say we need seed, and it's going to run the following. So node, and then require es build dash register and Prisma. So inside our Prisma directory / seed.ts, and make sure we add our comment just below. All right, so we should now be able to run our seed and add some data into our database. I'm just going to clear this in the terminal, and I'm going to run npx prisma db and then seed. Give that a second, and you should hopefully see this cute little leaf here along with the following statement that the seed command has been executed. Now below, like I showed earlier with our SQLite Explorer, we can go ahead and just quickly refresh this. We can go ahead and check out the author table, and you can see just over here on the side that we have our authors added. So we have William Shakespeare, Yuval Noah Harari, and John Doe, along with their dates and their IDs. We can also see our books. So if I hit play here, you can see that we have 3 books added, with Homo Deus, Sapiens, and the Ugly Duckling, with one being fiction, and the ID of the author, so author ID 2, which is referencing the our Yuval Noah Harari author. So back in here, we can see that Yuval Noah Harari has an ID of 2. Cool, so that pretty much sums up our database setup. The next thing now is to go ahead and start building our API and get this up and running so that we can use it in a much more user-friendly way. Okay, so to get started with our API, the first thing I've done is jumped back into our index.ts file, which we defined inside our source directory. Let's go ahead and first make the necessary installation. So I'm going to go ahead and import all as .env from .env, and then import express from express, import cause from cause, and that's about it. So first, let's go ahead and get our .env config. So we'll say that. The next thing I want to do is inside our .env file, since we already have one, it'd be nice to define our port there as well. So let's go ahead and say port. I mean, we could just easily define that inside our index.ts file, but since we have this, let's just define it here. So I'm going to run it on port 8000. Close this now. Okay, so back inside index.ts, let's go ahead and first say if not process dot env dot port, then process dot exit 1. So if there's no port defined, then just exit the application. Next, let's get our port from the .env file. This is a type number, and pass int, say process.env.port as string, and then 10 like that, so base 10. So we get our 8,000. Next, let's go ahead and create our app. So we'll say app equals express, like so. Okay, so first let's assign our cause middleware to Express, and it's very easy to do that. We just say app.use and then cause. And we want our Express application to use JSON, so we say app use and then express.json. All right, and just below that, let's go ahead and add our listen. So app.listen, and say on the port, add an anonymous function and say console.log listening on port, and then our port. So we'll say port that. These are backticks, by the way, if you can see them clearly, and that's just so we can add our variable port there as well. All right, now we can actually go ahead and run this. So inside our terminal, run npm run dev, and if you remember earlier, we defined our dev script here, so it just runs nodemon on it, and there we go. So you should see hopefully this listening on port 8000. Now if I go to Insomnia, I'm gonna go ahead and create a new collection. I'm gonna call this TypeScript library API. All right, let's go ahead and create a new request. It's going to be on HTTP localhost and then port 8000. If I create that and I send, we get, whoops, that should be the name. Let me just add that here. So in the get, let me just zoom in as well. So here where it says get, we can add our URL. So localhost port 8000, send, and we just get a not found, so cannot get. But our server is up and running. All right, so the first thing I want to highlight is the way we're going to structure this application. Let me just close that. So we're going to have our APIs, so our routers, and then we're also going to have a service. And the service is just going to be our way of communicating with the database. So what we'll do is inside source, let's first create one for our authors. So I'm going to say author, and inside that, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this author.service.ts. So first, let's go ahead and create our services. Zoom in again, or maybe not. Hopefully this should be fine for you guys. All right, so inside that, first thing we need to do is import db from our db.server file. All right, okay, let's go ahead and create a function that just lists out the authors. So we'll say const and then list authors. This is async, as we're communicating with our Prisma client. It's going to return a promise of an author, and we'll define this type in a second. And there we go. All right, so above this, what we want to return is, let's say we just want to return the ID, first name and last name. So we don't want to return any of the extra added information with each author. So we don't want to return the created at, updated at, first or updated at and created at, just these two. So to do that, let's create our type. So we'll say author, and then we'll have our first name, which is our first property, which is ID, and then first name, which is string. I mean, we could just omit this from our author that we define in the model, but this just makes it a bit more cleaner to read. All right, so inside this, let's go ahead and return db.author.findMany. And here we'll just say select, which will just select the properties that we want. And inside that, we'll say ID true and first name true and last name true. All right, so we're getting this error because last name is missing the following properties from type author, and it shouldn't really be complaining. We have the type author, which we defined just now. Silly mistake. These should all be commas. Maybe not. Why is this not const? I also should export this, I think. We have this async promise. And this is returning a list of authors, not a single author. So we're promising an array of authors. Sorry about that. That was just a silly mistake from my end. But this function should now work. So let's, inside our author directory again, create a new file. We'll say author.router.ts. And inside that, let's go ahead and build our author endpoints. So first of all, we need express from express. Let's import some types. So we need import type, which is a request and a response from express. We also need our validator, so what we installed in the beginning, our express validator, so validation results from express validator. And then let's just import all as author service from author service. And we also need to export our router. So we'll say const and then author router equals express dot router. All right. So the first one, we will just get a list of authors or all authors. We'll say author router dot get, say /, and we'll define the URLs in a second. So async and then request, that's going to type request, and response, type response. And here, let's define the body of it. So first we'll say try, and we'll say const authors equals await author service list authors. Then we'll return response of status 200 and JSON authors. And then finally we need to also add our catch. And we'll say error, and we'll say that's type any, just so TypeScript does not complain. And then response.status, say 500, and we'll just return error.message. All right, so we have our first endpoint, which is our get endpoint, and now we need our actual API to recognize that. So inside index.tsx, what we need to do is first import our author router. So we'll say just below here, import author router from author router. And now down below, we can add that by saying app.use. And here, let's define our endpoints. So our URLs, so API / authors, and then author router. All right, that should be our author router set up. So what we can do now is go into our API interface. So I'm going to use Insomnia. I'm just going to go ahead and change the name of this and say get authors, and then just clear that. Now here we can say / API, so in the URL, / authors, and if I hit send, we now get back a list of authors with ID, first name, and last name. As what we told our service function to get our authors is that we just want those three. If you want to specify date created and update, you can of course add that. So back inside, let me just adjust these quickly. Move this screen. Oops, what am I doing? Move this over here. But inside our author service, we can of course specify something like date created, which is a date. And then here we can just say date created. I think that's what we called it. Or am I wrong? Where's our schema? We called it created at. So back inside there, we can just say something like created at, and then here we can say created at, and then true. Now if I go back and I hit send again, we get our created at as well. But I'm going to exclude that as it just kind of clutters it, and just remove that here as well. All right, so that's our list endpoint. Now let's go ahead and let's say we want an endpoint that retrieves only one author. So, and that will be based on the ID. So inside our author service, let's go ahead and add a new function, and this will just be get author. So we'll say export const get author equals async, and this will take in an ID of type number, promise, and this will either return back an author or return back null. And inside that, we'll just say return db.author.findUnique, and inside there, put in curly brackets and say where the ID matches with what we passed in. And again, this is just shorthand for saying ID, as both have the same name, so we can just shorten it to ID. All right, so that was, again, very, very simple. So we just had to write a few lines, and we now have a service function that will retrieve an author from our database. Back inside our router, let's go ahead and create a new endpoint. So get a single author by ID, say author router get, and here we'll say / and then colon ID. And then what we need to add is the response, the async response. So we'll say async request, response, and we'll get the ID. So ID of type number equals pass int and request.params.id of radix or base 10. And then we'll do our try. So try, say const author equals await author service get author, and then pass in the ID. And then we'll say if author, we want to return that author. So response.status, say 200, and then JSON, throw in that author. Otherwise, we want to return a response status of 404, so response.status 404, and we'll just add author could not be found. And then finally add our catch, so error of type any, and just return the same thing that we did earlier, which was our 500. So I'm just going to copy it from the last one, paste it in, and there we go. So if we head back now to Insomnia, we have, for example, an author of ID 1, so William Shakespeare. And if I add to this, let me just duplicate this and say get single author. Here I can pass in the ID of 1. If I hit send, we get back the author ID 1 created at, updated at first name and last name. And then one thing to note as well is that this author isn't being strictly checked. So if we want to just return the ID, first name, last name, and all that, so we can just say select and then ID true, first name true, and last name true. And now if I hit run again, send, we get back those three. But I guess for the sake of our detail endpoint, it might be cool to have that. And it's lucky actually that we don't have strict checking on, otherwise this wouldn't have run and TypeScript would have complained that we haven't defined created at, updated at, which I guess could be a bit misleading, but that's fine for now. All right, so the next endpoint is one that will allow us to create an author. So inside our services, let's go ahead. This is not services, this is our router. Inside services, let's create a new function that will allow us to create one. So we'll say export and then const create author async and then author, and this will use the same type as we defined earlier. However, we don't want the ID, so we can omit that by saying author and then ID. So we just want first name and last name, and this will promise a author. So we'll say author like so. Let me just shrink that. Okay. So inside this, we'll say const, and let's extract the first and last name from our author that we pass in. So we'll say just here, first name, last name, and then we can add return db.author.create. And why is this complaining now? Create. What happened here? Let me just go back a second. All right, here we will add, just add a space there. Okay, so we want the const first name, last name from our author, and then let's return our db.author.create. We'll say data, and we just need the first name and last name as that's all our database requires. So last name like so, and then below that we can just select the data that we want. So we'll say ID true, first name true, last name true. All right, so now we have our create service function. Before we go ahead and add all this back, so that we don't jump back and forth from our router file, let's go ahead and create two more, one to handle updating an author and one for deleting. So again, just below our create, we'll say update author async, and this will be author of type omit author and ID. So So we don't want to pass in the ID. ID will be kept separately as that will come from our parameter or our URL parameter. And then promise, say author, and we're missing our const here. All right, so we need first name, last name, author, and then return db.author.update. And we need to specify where we want to update. So we want to update it we want to update the object based on the ID that we pass in. And then we want to give the data. So data, and this will be first name and last name. And then finally, we can just select what we want. So we want the ID, the first name, and the last name. And there we have it. So that's our update. Pretty clean as well. I mean, we specify where, the data that we're passing in, and we can just select the properties that we want. Finally, this one as well is very short and sweet. So we'll say export const delete author, async, say ID, number. So we'll delete the author based on the ID that we pass in via the URL parameter. This will return nothing. So we'll say void. And we'll say await db.author.delete. And we will delete it where the ID matches the ID that we pass in. So that's our delete function. We have our update and also our post. Now we need our APIs to make use of those. So inside our author.router.ts file, let's go ahead and first create our post. So we'll say author router.post, and then we need just a /. Next, let's make use of our express validator. So we want to make sure, so we're going to be passing in 2 parameters, and let me just specify that above. So post, create a author, and we'll say params, the first name and last name. All right, so we need to first check our first name. So one thing we can do is say body and then first name. If you remember earlier, we imported body above here. And then we want to, let's say we want to make sure that this is a string. So to or is string. We also want to check our last name. So that's the same thing as well. So body is or last name dot is string. And then let's do async request response of type response. Inside that, let's go ahead and first check our validation errors. So we'll say const errors equals a validation result, which is again something that we imported earlier from Express Validator. And this will check to see if we have any validation errors that occurred. So we'll pass in the request, and then we'll say if no errors is empty, then return response.status 400, and JSON in there we'll say errors.array. So this will return back any of the validation errors that show up, and we can check that out when this is complete. So we'll say const author. Otherwise, if everything worked out smoothly, let's get the author from request.body. Then say our new author equals await author service.create author, and we just need to pass in the author that we get from our request body. And then finally, let's just return response dot status 201.json and our new author. Otherwise, let's catch error, type any, and we'll return our 500. So we'll just copy this from the last endpoint, paste it in here. All right, so now we have our post or our create author. Let's go back to our endpoint. We're gonna go ahead and duplicate this. We'll say post author, say create. All right, so first of all, if you're using Insomnia, let's change this to a post request and let's add our body. This is going to be in JSON format. So let's go ahead and first say first name, camel case, and we'll say the author is Jane and last name is Doe. Let's go ahead and send this and we get that back. We get back ID, first name and last name. If I go now and get all authors, so maybe I renamed them wrong. This should be post create author, and this one should just be get authors. But inside our get authors, if I hit send, we can now get back our new author that we added, which is Jane Doe. But let's check out our validation. Let's say if I miss out the last name, if I send this, we get back invalid value, last name, body, and if I get the authors, it wasn't added as it just returned the error. Or let's say, for example, if I just bring that back, if I set the first name to an integer, so 234, I send that, we get back first name, invalid value, and it returns a value as well. So Express Validator does a lot for us, which is really nice. So we can kind of leave this off now. So let's now go back and add our put endpoint. So the one that will manage our updating of an author. So author router.put. And sorry if this becomes a bit repetitive, but the point is to kind of drive this home. Inside this, we'll have the same set of validation, so we can copy this here. So we want to check first name and last name, as these are the only things that can be updated. Next, let's add async, and we'll have our request, response, and let's add some comments above that. So we'll say this is responsible for updating an author. So this is a put, and inside that, let's go ahead and first check our validation errors. So again, we can copy this, paste that in there. Then let's do our try. So first, let's just go ahead and say const author equals request.body. We also need the ID from our URL. So just above our try, let's go ahead and get that. So we'll say ID number equals pass int request.params.id 10, and then let's continue. We'll say const updated author equals await author service dot update author, and then we pass in the author that we get from our body and then ID. If that works out smoothly, then we can return response.status 200 JSON and updated author. Otherwise, let's catch that error, any, and we'll return our 500. I'm just going to copy the one from earlier and just paste that in. All right, so now we have our update. We can go ahead and try that out in a second. But finally, let's go ahead and just add our delete, which works in a very simple way as well. So we'll say author, router, and then delete based on the ID in the URL, async request of type request and response. Response. And we'll say const ID number equals pass int and request.params.id base 10. And here we'll say try await author service dot delete based on the ID, and then return response. And here we can say 204 for no content, and JSON we'll just say author has been successfully deleted. And then for our catch, again, error, any, you can just paste in our 500 error like we did earlier. All right, so now we have two new endpoints. We have our put and our delete. Just add this here, delete and author based on the ID. All right, let's go ahead and flex this. So let's create a new endpoint. So we'll say update author. This will share the same or a similar URL. Copy this one, paste that in, base it on the ID. So let's go with number 3. This will be a put, and we need to add the body. So this is going to be JSON. And first, let's just check what the ID of 3 is. So if I hit send here, it's John Doe. Let's update that. Say we want to change first name, first name over to Michael, and last name we can just keep it as, always say Smith. If I send this, we get back Michael Smith, and the ID is 3, so the one that used to belong to John Doe. If I go back to get authors, and if I hit send, we can see now that the one with ID 3 is Michael Smith, and the same if I do the detail one, it's Michael Smith. And you also get to see the difference between the updated at, so created at is the one that when we initially created this, and then the updated at is when we later changed it. All right, so that's our update. Let's go ahead now and create another one. Let's duplicate this and say delete author, create, and this is going to be a delete. And let's delete the one with ID. Let's do an ID that doesn't exist. If I hit send, we get back this rather ugly one. I mean, we can of course change it, but it says that this failed, 500 error. All right, that's good. If I run it with ID 4, if I send this now, nobody returned for that response. We just get a 204, no content. And that works out well. So both our update, delete work along with our post, get single item, or get detail author, and get list authors. All of those work as well, which is great news. Now we can move on to working on our book service and router. And this is where we'll also check out a bit more of what comes with Prisma in terms of how we specify the data that is returned. So just like we've done for our author directory where we have the author.root.ts and the service.ts file, we're also going to create a similar directory for our books. So I'm going to call this book, And inside there, create a new file. First one being book.service.ts. And whilst we're at it, let's just create the book.router.ts file as well. All right, so the first endpoint we're gonna do, we'll start off simple. We'll just list the books, all the books that we have in our database. So the first thing is we need to import DB from our utils db.server file. Then let's go ahead and define the type is going to return. So I'm going to create two different types. One type is going to define the reading of a book. So when we read a book from our database, and the other is going to define what it'll look like when we write a book. But first, let's just stick with reading a book. So we'll say book read equals, and then we'll have an ID. So we want to bring back the number. We want the title, which is going to be a string. We want date publish, which is going to be a date. Is fiction, which is a boolean, and the author ID. So we'll stay with the author ID, and we'll extend on this by actually returning a bit more about the author rather than just the ID. So for our reading type, this is what we'll use for our list books function. So we'll say export const list books async, and then we will return a promise which will hold book read, and it's going to be an array. And finally, we'll do that. All right, so first we need to just write our return. We'll say db.return book.find many. And then inside that, we'll set what we want to select. So we want, as you can see with book read, we want the ID, title, date published, is fiction, and author ID. So we can say ID true. Actually, I need this select here. So we want ID to be true. We want title to be true. Date published, true. The is fiction, true. And the author ID to be true. And there we go. It fits the criteria that we have for the return type. So a list of book read in that form. Now we can go ahead and add the first router for our books. So to do that, let's go ahead and import express from express. Then we need to import our type. So import type request. If I can type request response from express. We also want to import body validation result for later use from express validator. All right, so let's import our book service. So import all as book service from book service. Let's create our router. So const and then book router equals express dot router. Then let's create our get endpoint. So get list all the books. Say book router dot get / and then async request is, whoops, did that just import something? Yeah, it did. This is going to be type request response, and then we'll say try, and then const books equals await book service dot list books, and we'll set it as that. And then we'll return response dot status of 200 if everything checks out, and we'll JSON the books that we get back. And then finally, we want to catch the error. So again, very repetitive from what we did last time for our get list all authors. Here, any, and then return response dot status, and then here we'll add 500, and we can just return JSON error dot message. All right. So of course our API or our server does not know about this, so we have to add that inside our index.ts file. To do that, let's first import that. So inside index.ts, import book router from book router. And then down below, we can go ahead and say app.use /API/books, and we'll say book router. And there we go. Now our server knows about our new book router. So let's go ahead and run the server. I already turned mine off, but if you want to run it again, so npm run dev. So now I'm going to head back over to Insomnia. I'm going to open up a new request. It's going to be list, or just say list all the books. Great. And then here the endpoint is going to be, you just copy this as a template, and it will be localhost port 8000, whatever port you set it as, and then books. Now if I hit send, we get back 3 of the books that we added when we seeded our database. So we get back Homo Deus, Sapiens, and the Ugly Duckling, along with also mainly to look out for is this author ID, as it's just returning the ID of the author that we have. However, in reality, this may not be that useful, as you may want to actually represent the author inside of this JSON response. So we can go ahead and extend that now. So to do that, let's head back over to our book service.ts file. And for that, let's go ahead and go back to the top of this file, and where we have author ID, let's go ahead and get rid of it. I'm just going to comment it out just in case, just for reference sake. But above that, we need author. Now the type of this is going to be something along the lines of ID, first name, and last name. And we already have that defined inside our author service. So we need to import this, otherwise we're just going to get these errors. To do that, first let's go back into our author.service.ts file. And just before we say type with the author, let's export it like so. Now back inside book.service, we can go ahead and import it. So we can say import type, and we'll say author. And this is from author.service. And there we go. We should have no complaints with our types. However, our list books function is no longer working. We're getting an error back because what we're returning does not match an object inside this array. So to do that, we need to specify what the author will look like. And we already have a reference to the author in book, as we added that as a foreign key. So we're going to say, oops, I'll comment this out actually. So we'll say author, and then inside that we say select. So what do you want to select from the author? And then inside there we'll say ID true, first name true, and last name true. So now we have the author and we have no more complaints. So if we go back now to Insomnia, or whatever interface you're using, if I hit send now we get back author with the ID, first name, and last name. So it's pretty easy to extend that. All we had to do with Prisma is just address the foreign key and then select what properties we want of that foreign key. So ID, first name, and last name. Cool. So that's our list books. Let's go ahead now and create the other endpoints. Now this is going to feel a bit repetitive. So just bear with me, but just for completion's sake, let's go ahead and add all of this. So we'll say get book async. This will take in an ID, which will be of type number. It's going to promise a book read or null if the book does not exist. I'll say return db.book find unique. And here we'll specify that the where is going to be where ID matches with ID. And then we want to select what we want to select. So as it's in the form of book read, where we have ID, title, and all this, along with this author, we can go ahead and pretty much copy this thing here. Ooh. If I'm able to copy, otherwise let's just type it out. So ID true. We want title as true. The is fiction. I mean, we could set this as a variable and just unpack it, but it's, I think, just nicer if we type this out explicitly. And then author, we want to select ID true, first name true, and last name true. All right, so now we have our get book. So inside, actually, let's go ahead and just define all these service functions first, and then we can head back into our router. That way we're not jumping back and forth from each one. The next one is going to handle the creation of a book. So create book equals async, and then book. And now we need to specify the type of this book. So we already have this book read, and we can't really use that as, unless you want to pass in the entire ID, first name and last name of the author, which is definitely redundant, especially with first name and last name. We could just pass in the author ID. So for this type, let's go ahead and create a new one, and we'll call this book write. So we'll say type book write equals, and then in here we'll say title string, then date published, which is type date, then author ID, so that's what we'll pass in, which will be a number, and is fiction, so Boolean. So now down below we can go back to our create, and we can set book as being a type of book write. Then what we need to add is the promise. So we'll say promise, and this is going to return book read. So we want the author ID along with first name and last name rather than the ID itself. So here we can say const, and let's just unpack book. So we can get the title, author ID, date published, and is fiction. Then we can say const, and let's just pass the date to make sure it's date. We'll say new date and throw in date published. And then down below we'll say return db book dot create. And here we'll pass in the data, which will be title, author ID, is fiction, and date published, we'll set that as pass date. Actually, we'll name this pass date. This has already been passed, so we'll call it pass date. All right, so we're still getting a complaint because the return type of this does not fit book read. And to do that, we can just add in, again, the same select that we defined before. So I'm just going to copy this for the sake of time. And down here, underneath data, so underneath that comma, We can paste that in, hit save, it should format it for you. And then, yeah, that's about it. That's our create book. Now let's go ahead and create our update author or update book service. So here we'll say export const update book async. We'll say book write and the ID. So the ID that we passed in, that we will pass through via the URL param. Promise will be book read. Let's go ahead and write that. So we'll say const, and then that equals book, and we can extract the properties from that. So we'll say title is fiction, date published, and author ID. Now we'll say return, and then db.book.update. We'll set where, so we need to say which object we want to change in the database, so where the ID matches with the ID that we passed through. And then data, we can just say title, and then is fiction, date published, and author ID. Below that, we can select what we want. So I still got it on my clipboard, so I'm going to paste in that select, and that should be it for our update. So the select, to make sure, is the exact same as we have in all the other functions that we defined above. So that's our update book. The last one is just to delete a book, and this one's fairly simple. So we'll say export const, and we'll say delete book equals async ID number promise, and it's going to return back void. And here say await db.book.delete where ID matches the ID that we passed in. So that's all our service functions done again. So it's all just CRUD stuff: create, read, update, and delete. So we have our update, our delete one, and also our create, get, and get list. All right, so that's our services done. Let's jump back into our router file, and let's utilize our service functions inside our API. So the next one is to get a book based on the ID. Say book router.get, and then ID. Say async request response, and then here we'll get the ID and make sure that it's a number. So we'll say equals pass int and request.params.id base 10, and then underneath that try const book equals await book service dot get book, pass in ID, and then if the book exists, return response dot status dot 200 dot JSON and book. Finally, we need to catch any errors. So error of type any, return response dot status 500, and then JSONify the error, so error dot message. Okay, that's our get ID. We can go now and just test that out. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually duplicate this. So get a single book, and here we can pass in the ID. So if I pass in ID 1, send, we get back the first book, which is Homo Deus, along with the author, date published, etc. If I pass in a ID that does not exist, we get back, hopefully, if this responds. Is it going to respond? Try again. Okay, maybe it resolves in a second. But for some reason, this is taking a lot longer than it should. Let me just restart the server. All right, never mind. We'll come back to that. So the next one is our post endpoint. So we'll say book router.post. Here, just /. And then for this one, we need to set up our validation as well. So we'll say body. So what we imported at the beginning of this file, title dot is string. So that makes sure it's a string, body, and then author ID, because we'll be passing in the author ID when creating a book. And then we'll check to make sure that this is int. Let me just save this. And then we want body, shrink the size body, and we want the date published. And for this, we'll say is date. And I know we kind of convert it into a date later on in our service, but we can add toDate, which should also do the same thing. We'll convert it to date. And then body, we'll add is fiction. And we'll say is Boolean. All right, so underneath that, we'll say async request response, and let's go ahead and define the body of our function. So we'll first check to make sure there are no validation errors. So const errors equals validation result and request. And then if not errors dot is empty, return response of status 400 and JSON errors dot array. Underneath that, let's add our try, and this will say const book equals request dot body, and we'll get our new book. So we'll say const new book equals await book service dot create book, and throw in our book. Finally, let's return response dot status, and we'll say 201 JSON new book. And then here, let's add our catch. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the catch that we've defined earlier to save some time. Paste that in, and there we go. So if I go back, I don't know for some reason why this one didn't run, but let's go ahead and create a new request. It's going to be create book, and we'll post it. Let's get that URL from this one. Paste that in. Now, if I just send anything, we get back, as we didn't pass anything in the body, we get back all the errors, the validation errors. So we need title, author ID, date published, and is fiction. So for here, I'm just going to copy the date from this one. We only need the date. The time doesn't really matter. So if I go back to create book, let's create a body JSON, and we'll say title. Let's create Harry Potter, and we'll say the author ID, which we need as an integer, we'll say as 2, date published. We can paste in this date. Let's just change it up a bit. Let's say 2002. And the last one I think is fiction. And we'll set this to false because it's based on a true story. So let's go ahead and send that, and we get back our book. So we have Harry Potter is fiction false, date published, which is 2002. And the time, if we don't add a time, it just sets it to midnight. The author ID, Yuval Noah Harari, which I guess we've added quite a few books written by him. But let's add something else. Who else do we have for get authors? So we have William Shakespeare of ID 1, can do something for him. Let's go ahead and add Macbeth. We'll say ID 1. This is published. Oops. This here was probably, I don't know when it was published. I don't know, like 1600s or something. So 1640. Send that. So now we have a book for William Shakespeare. If we list all the books now, we get back so we get back our new ones, Harry Potter and Macbeth. All right, so that's our create book. Now we need one for our update, which again is very similar to our create, just that we have the ID passed in the parameters. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this book rooted post and paste it down below. Now let's make all the necessary changes. So first of all, this is a put. Let me just add the comment above it. So put update book. So our validation still checks out. In the case of our errors, all this can remain the same. We can get the book from this. And here, let's call this updated book. And rather than create book, we need to update book. And we also need to pass in the ID. So just above that. So actually here, we'll say const ID type number. And we can, pass int and request.params.id base 10. And in our update book, we can pass in the ID. And for our JSON response, updated book, which is that. So let's go ahead now and let's copy this, duplicate, update a book. So update a book, this is going to be a put. Let's update the one with ID 4. Let's take the body of this. Actually, let's check what ID of 4 is. So what's the one with ID 4? So it's Harry Potter and Yuval Noah Harari. Let's say we want to change the author of this. So in put update a book, in our JSON, let's paste this in. Let's say the ID is now the author with ID 3. If I send this, we cannot put API books. Why is that? Book router put. Let me just restart the server. Oops. If I send this now, 404 not found. I didn't put in the ID in the URL parameters. So just here where you see my cursor, we need the ID. Save that. Now if I send it, we get back the author is now a dude called Michael Smith. All right, so, and we also have Macbeth. I think before it was Harry Potter, I think we changed quite a bit of this, but the ID is still 4, so it didn't update everything, it just updated all the properties apart from ID. All right, so now the final one is just to add our delete endpoint. Now this one again is very simple. So we'll say book router.delete. Inside this, we need the ID. Say async and then request, type request, response of type response. And then we can say const ID number equals pass int. I'll say request.params.id and 10. Say try, await, book service.delete book, and then just pass in the ID there. Return response.status, and this will be a 204. JSON will just say book was successfully deleted. And then for our catch, say error, or type any, and return response.status 500 JSON, and we'll say error.message. And that should be it. So let's create a new endpoint. Let's say we want to delete the one with ID 4. So new request, delete book. This will be a delete. Throw in that, let's send it. And we get back 204, no content. And now if I go back to get all books, hit send, we see that the book with ID 4 no longer exists. And that pretty much wraps up our TypeScript Express with Prisma API, where we just did some simple CRUD stuff, but also made use of foreign keys and how to treat those within our database. But I hope this video was of great value to you. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. All of this code will be made available in the GitHub link, which I will put in the description. Also, I have a Discord server, so if you want to join that, ask some questions or get to know people, feel free to join that. The link for that will also be in the description below. But otherwise, stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next video.